Elizabeth Carter never imagined that the children she raised with so much love would try to rip away from her the only companionship she had left, a dog named Buddy. But when Monica and Brian showed up with a truck to take the animal by force, she realized that was just the beginning of a much deeper family betrayal. What seemed like concern was actually a calculated plan to take her house, her belongings, and her freedom. They wanted to declare her incapable, put her in a nursing home, and sell everything. But what they didn't expect was that the dog they despised so much would be exactly the one to expose all their greed in front of a judge. This is the real story of a woman who almost lost everything, but who found strength where no one expected. But to understand, I'm gonna tell you how it all started. Elizabeth Carter was 75 years old, and honestly, she didn't expect much from life anymore. Ever since she lost her husband, the house got way too quiet, you know? That kind of silence that weighs on your shoulders and makes you question if anyone really cares. That's when Buddy showed up, a golden retriever puppy with those brown eyes that seemed to understand everything without needing words. He was more than a dog. He was the reason she woke up every day with a smile on her face. Every morning, Buddy would jump on her bed with that contagious energy, licking her face until she laughed. And look, laughing had become rare after she became a widow. The two had a routine: breakfast together, a walk around the block, and in the afternoon, he'd lay at her feet while Elizabeth read her novels. It was companionship that didn't demand anything, that didn't judge, that simply loved. That Thursday night, Elizabeth was on the living room couch, petting Buddy's head while watching her favorite show. The warmth of his body against her legs was comforting, almost like a constant hug that said, "You're not alone." The house was cozy, with that smell of freshly brewed coffee still hanging in the air. Everything seemed peaceful, at least for now. That's when Monica, her ungrateful daughter, arrived without warning, like she'd been doing lately, and the atmosphere changed completely. She didn't even take her coat off properly before dropping those words cold as a knife. "That animal just costs money, Mom. You don't need him." Elizabeth's hand froze on the dog's golden fur, and something inside her chest tightened. The air got heavy, dense, like a storm was about to break right there inside that cozy room. Buddy lifted his head, as if sensing the tension in the air, and looked at Elizabeth with that unwavering loyalty that only dogs know how to offer. Monica kept talking about the vet, expensive dog food, responsibilities that a woman her age shouldn't have. Elizabeth could barely process the words. All she heard was the echo of that phrase, "You don't need him." What do you mean, didn't need him? Buddy was literally all that was left of genuine affection in her life. "Monica, he's my companion," Elizabeth tried to argue, her voice coming out shaky and low. But her daughter just rolled her eyes in that way that made Elizabeth feel small, invisible. "Companion? Mom, what you need is people around, not an animal that just dirties the house and costs money." The cruelty of those words was palpable, cutting, and Elizabeth felt like she was being torn apart inside. Buddy moved closer to her, pressing his warm snout against her hand, as if saying, "I'm here, I'll always be here." Elizabeth ran her fingers through his silky fur, trying to calm down, trying not to let despair take over. Monica grabbed her purse and headed toward the door, but before leaving, she turned with that cold look. "We need to talk about this more seriously, Mom. Think about it." And she left, leaving suffocating silence behind. That night, after the door closed, Elizabeth hugged Buddy tight and let the tears fall freely onto his soft fur. "They're not gonna take you from me," she whispered, feeling her heart beating erratically in her chest. The dog just licked her face, as if promising he'd never abandon her. Unlike certain people who should love her unconditionally, his loyalty was simple, pure, without hidden agendas or demands. But Elizabeth still didn't know how far her children were willing to go to get her out of that house and control her life. What seemed like just an unpleasant conversation was actually the beginning of a family betrayal she never imagined facing. And Buddy, that dog Monica called a useless expense, would be exactly the one to reveal the truth behind this entire dark plan. Sitting in that silent room, with Buddy still lying at her feet, Elizabeth let memory take her far away, to the times when Monica and Brian were just children full of dreams. She remembered how she gave up so much, you know? That spot at the university she'd gotten, the job that paid well, everything to dedicate herself entirely to her children. At the time, it seemed like the right choice, the only possible choice for an elderly mother who loved unconditionally. They lived in a small town in the countryside where everyone knew each other and money was always tight. Elizabeth worked as a seamstress at home, spending sleepless nights finishing orders and making sure the kids had decent clothes, school supplies, and at least 3 meals a day. Her husband did what he could as a mechanic, but there was never much left at the end of the month. Still, she never let Monica and Brian feel a lack of love or attention. That was sacred to her. She remembered the simple birthday parties, but full of affection, made with homemade cake and improvised decorations with crepe paper. She remembered how she saved penny by penny to buy that dress Monica wanted so badly for graduation, or the video game Brian begged for months. They were small sacrifices in the eyes of the world, maybe, but they weighed on the back of a woman who dreamed, yes, of something more for herself. But the kids always came first, always. Elizabeth taught them both to be honest, hardworking, grateful for what they had. She passed on values, told stories about respect and empathy, believing she was building decent human beings. Monica was the more studious one, Brian the more playful, but both seemed to understand the effort she made, or at least that's what Elizabeth believed, holding tight to that illusion that the love she planted would bloom when they grew up. The years passed way too fast, like they always do when you're too busy to notice. Monica graduated in business administration, got a good job in the big city, and rarely came back to visit. Brian pursued a career as a real estate agent, got married, had kids, but the visits also became increasingly spaced out. Elizabeth didn't complain, after all. They had their own lives now, right? She swallowed the loneliness and pretended everything was fine. When her husband passed away 3 years ago, Elizabeth hoped the kids would get closer, that they'd realize she needed them. At first they even came, organized the funeral, stayed a few days, but soon they went back to their routines, leaving her alone in that house, too big for just one person. That's when Buddy came into her life, a rescue from a local shelter that completely changed the meaning of companionship. He filled the void the kids left without demanding anything in return. Now looking back, Elizabeth saw the bitter irony of the situation. She had dedicated entire decades to raising Monica and Brian, giving up her own dreams and comfort. And what did she get in return? Coldness, distance, and now, contempt for the only being that still made her feel loved. Buddy slept peacefully at her feet, oblivious to all this pain, just existing there with that purity that humans seem to lose over time. How did we get to this point? Elizabeth whispered into the void, absent-mindedly petting the dog's soft ear. She never imagined that the emotional story of dedication and love she built for years could turn into something so painful. The children she raised with so much care now saw her as a burden, and worse, they saw Buddy the same way. It was as if all the sacrifice meant absolutely nothing. But Elizabeth still didn't know that apparently casual conversation with Monica was just the beginning of something much bigger. Her children had plans, conversations behind her back, agreements she couldn't even imagine, and the dog they despised so much would, ironically, be the only faithful witness to everything that was coming, and maybe the only defense Elizabeth would have against the planned revenge of a life she herself helped build. It was on a Saturday morning that Brian showed up at Elizabeth's door without warning. And look, she found it strange, because he never visited without some specific reason. He came in with that forced smile, kissed her cheek quickly, and went straight to the kitchen, as if he were at home. Buddy ran to greet him, wagging his tail all excited, but Brian barely looked at the dog. Elizabeth felt a tightness in her chest. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in the air. They had coffee together, talked about trivial things, the weather, the grandkids, his work. Elizabeth tried to enjoy that rare moment with her son, but noticed he was restless, checking his phone, looking around. It was when she served the second cup of coffee that Brian finally dropped the bomb, without beating around the bush, without preparation. "Mom, you need to get rid of this dog." The words fell like a hammer on the table, completely breaking that false morning harmony. Elizabeth almost choked on her coffee, blinking several times as if she hadn't understood correctly. "What do you mean, Brian? We already talked about this." But he interrupted her, impatient, with that tone of someone who's already made a decision and doesn't want to hear arguments. "No, Mom, you didn't understand. If you don't get rid of this dog, We're gonna put him in a shelter. It's for your own good." The "your own good" sounded so false, so rehearsed, that Elizabeth felt nauseous. She tried to argue, her voice failing, her hands shaking while she held the cup. "Brian, he's all I have. Please, don't do this to me." But her son just shook his head, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "We already talked, Monica and me. You're getting old, Mom. You can't even take care of yourself, let alone an animal this size." Every word was a stab, and Elizabeth felt the ground disappearing from under her feet. That's when it clicked. They'd already planned everything. It wasn't a conversation. It was a warning. Monica and Brian had planned this behind her back, probably in calls, messages, meetings from which she was completely excluded. The family betrayal hurt more than anything Elizabeth had ever felt, because it came exactly from the people she raised, fed, loved without reservations. And now they were there, treating her like a problem to be solved. Brian got up from the table, grabbed his jacket, and headed toward the door. But before leaving, he turned with that cold look Elizabeth didn't recognize anymore. "Think about it, Mom. This house is too big for you. It would be better to sell and go to a place where they have care, you know? People prepared to deal with your age." There, it was said. The real objective. It wasn't about Buddy. It never was. It was about getting her out of there, controlling her belongings, her life, her choices. Elizabeth stood frozen in the middle of the room, hearing Brian's car start outside, feeling her legs go weak. Buddy approached, pressed his cold snout against her hand, and only then did the tears start to fall. In her children's eyes, Buddy was just an obstacle, an inconvenient detail that got in the way of their plans to convince her to sell the house and move to a nursing home. They didn't even try to hide the greed anymore, the contempt, the rush to get rid of her. She sat on the living room floor, hugging the dog, sobbing softly while Buddy licked her face. "What did I do wrong?" she whispered to him, as if the animal could answer, explain how love turned into something so distorted. Elizabeth had dedicated her entire life to those two, and now she discovered that to them she was nothing more than a hindrance, an annoying responsibility that needed to be managed, preferably far away, where she wouldn't bother anyone. That afternoon, as the sun set outside, Elizabeth made a silent decision. She wasn't going to give up. She wasn't going to let them take Buddy from her, or control her life as if she were incapable. But what she still didn't know was how far Monica and Brian were willing to go to get what they wanted, and that the worst, the real public scandal, was still to come. 2 weeks passed in agonizing silence, with no news from Monica or Brian. And look, Elizabeth actually preferred it that way. She enjoyed every day with Buddy, walking through the neighborhood, feeling the sun on her face, trying to save every moment as if it were the last. But deep down, really deep down, she knew this was far from over. It was like living under a dark cloud that could come crashing down at any moment, you know? It was on a Saturday morning that everything exploded. Elizabeth was in the kitchen preparing lunch, with Buddy lying near the front door like he always did. He loved guarding the house, like a silent guardian. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a heavy engine parking in front of the house. When she looked out the window, her blood ran cold. It was a big truck, and Monica was getting out of it next to Brian. They'd come back, and they weren't alone. Elizabeth ran to the living room, her heart racing, trying to understand what was happening. Monica came in without knocking, with a collar and leash in her hand, and Brian came right behind with that look of someone fulfilling an unpleasant but necessary mission. "Mom, we warned you." "You had your chance," Monica said, cold as ice, as she approached Buddy. The dog sensed the threat immediately, stood up, and started backing away, the fur on his neck standing up. "What are you doing? Get out of my house!" Elizabeth shouted, trying to put herself between her children and Buddy. But Brian held her by the shoulders, firmly, almost hurting. "Calm down, Mom. This is for your own good. The dog's going to a shelter where he'll be well taken care of." Lie. Elizabeth knew it was a lie. Saw in their eyes that Buddy's fate was uncertain, maybe even worse than she imagined. They just wanted to get rid of the problem as quickly as possible. Monica approached Buddy with the collar, but the dog wasn't going to make things easy. He barked loud, desperate, a sound Elizabeth had never heard before. It was pure terror. Monica tried to grab him, but Buddy dodged, running through the room, knocking over a vase on the way. Brian let go of Elizabeth and went after the animal, and the house turned into complete chaos. Elizabeth screamed, cried, begged them to stop, but it was like she was invisible. Finally, Brian managed to grab Buddy by the fur on his neck, and Monica snapped the collar on hard. The dog pulled desperately, his paws scratching the floor, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth as if begging for help. "No! You can't do this! He's mine! You don't have that right!" Elizabeth screamed, trying to reach Buddy, but Brian pushed her back, not violently, but firmly enough to make it clear she had no choice there. They started dragging Buddy toward the door, and the dog fought with all his strength, barking, crying that high-pitched cry that broke your heart. Elizabeth ran after them, stumbling over her own feet, her face wet with tears. "Please, please, don't take him from me. He's my family." Her voice came out hoarse, broken, loaded with a pain that seemed to tear her chest from the inside. But Monica and Brian continued, determined, as if they were just following bureaucratic protocol. That's when Buddy did something unexpected. He suddenly turned, pulling the collar with so much force that Monica lost her balance and dropped the leash. The dog shot back into the house, running straight into Elizabeth's arms, who threw herself on the floor to hug him. They stayed there, intertwined, her holding him with all the strength she had, while Buddy trembled and licked her face. "You stay with me, you stay," she whispered, her voice choked. Monica and Brian stood at the door, looking at that scene with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. You could only hear Elizabeth's labored breathing and Buddy's soft whimpers. Brian was the first to break the silence. "This isn't over, Mom. We'll be back." And they left, leaving the door open, the truck still running outside. Elizabeth stayed on the floor, hugging the dog, knowing that hadn't been an empty threat, and that the total humiliation she'd just felt was only the beginning of something much worse. After that terrible Saturday, Elizabeth's house was wrapped in a heavy silence, almost suffocating. Monica and Brian simply disappeared. No calls, no messages, not even an apology for what they did. It was like she'd ceased to exist for them, you know? And the worst part was that Elizabeth knew that silence wasn't peace. It was just the calm before the storm. They were going to come back. It was only a matter of time. Every night before going to sleep, she locked all the doors and windows of the house, checking 2-3 times. Buddy slept next to her bed now, and Elizabeth woke up in the middle of the night at any different sound. A car passing on the street, the wind hitting the window, the dog himself moving. Fear had settled in her chest like a permanent guest, stealing her sleep, her peace, even the pleasure of the little things she used to enjoy. During the day, Elizabeth tried to maintain her routine, but everything seemed to have lost its color. The walks with Buddy, which used to be moments of joy, now had a bitter taste of imminent farewell. She watched the dog running in the yard and thought, "How much longer will I have with him?" With each bark, each wagging tail, she saved that image in her memory, as if preparing for an inevitable loss. It was an anticipated pain, constant, that gave no respite. Some neighbors noticed something was wrong and tried to talk, offer help. Mrs. Martha, who lived in the house next door, even asked if everything was okay after that truck episode. Everyone had heard the screams after all. Elizabeth just smiled, thanked her, and said it was just a family misunderstanding. She couldn't talk about it without falling apart, and the last thing she wanted was to become a reason for pity or gossip in the neighborhood. The nights were the worst. Elizabeth sat in the living room armchair with Buddy at her feet, looking at the phone and waiting for what she didn't even know. A call? A threat? Maybe even an apology she knew would never come? Her children's silence was deafening, hurt more than any cruel words they could have said. It was like she'd been erased from their lives, discarded like an old object that's no longer useful. Buddy sensed her state, of course. Dogs always do, right? He stayed more attached, more attentive, licking her hand every time he saw tears in her eyes. It was like he understood he needed to be strong for both of them, that he was the one holding Elizabeth up at that moment. The irony didn't go unnoticed. The animal her children called a burden was exactly the one preventing her from completely falling apart. Elizabeth spent hours reliving every moment with Monica and Brian, trying to understand where it all went wrong. Had she been too protective, too absent, spoiled them too much, or demanded too little? The questions spun in her head without finding answers, and that hurt. It hurt in a way she couldn't even explain. Seeing the children you raised turn into people capable of so much cruelty, that's the kind of pain that has no remedy, that has no easy cure. But amid all that loneliness and despair, something started to change inside Elizabeth. It wasn't overnight, but gradually she realized she couldn't keep living in fear, passively waiting for her children to come back to finish what they started. They might have abandoned her emotionally. They might have planned to take everything from her. But one thing they weren't going to accomplish: making her abandon Buddy. "They can abandon me, but I'll never abandon you, Buddy," she whispered one night, petting the dog's head. That phrase became almost a mantra, a promise she repeated whenever fear threatened to take over. Elizabeth didn't yet know how she was going to face what was coming, but one certainty solidified inside her: she wasn't going to give up without a fight. And what she didn't imagine was that Monica and Brian were already several steps ahead, plotting something that went way beyond simply taking Buddy away. They wanted everything, and they were willing to use any means to get it. While Elizabeth lived through those weeks of anguish and loneliness, Monica and Brian were busy with something much more calculated than she could imagine. On a Tuesday afternoon, the two met at a law office downtown, one of those places with leather furniture, expensive paintings on the wall, and an air of seriousness that intimidates anyone. The lawyer, a middle-aged man named Richard Sullivan, received them with firm handshakes and professional smiles. He'd heard stories like this before, knew exactly the script. Monica got straight to the point, without beating around the bush, with that coldness she'd perfected over the years. "Our mother no longer has the capacity to take care of herself. She's elderly, confused, making irrational decisions. We need legal guardianship to protect her." Richard took notes on a yellow pad, asking technical questions about Elizabeth's health, about her assets, about how long they'd been noticing these signs of incapacity. Brian completed Monica's sentences, creating an almost perfect narrative of filial concern. The lawyer explained the process with that deep, measured voice of someone who's done this hundreds of times. "You're gonna need proof, medical reports, testimonies, evidence that she can't manage her own life anymore. If we can get that, the judge can grant guardianship, and you'll have total control over her assets." Monica and Brian exchanged glances. It was exactly what they wanted to hear. Total control meant selling the house, accessing the savings, deciding where she'd live. It was the perfect planned revenge, disguised as family care. "And there's one thing that complicates everything," Monica said, crossing her legs and sighing with false concern. "She has a huge dog, a golden retriever, spends a fortune on him and refuses to get rid of the animal, even without being able to take care of it." Richard raised an eyebrow, interested. "This can be used in our favor. It demonstrates irrational attachment, lack of sense of priorities. We can argue she puts an animal's welfare above her own health and safety." Brian smiled. It was genius, in his distorted view. They spent almost 2 hours in that office, building strategy, discussing deadlines, amounts. Richard charged a lot, but promised results. And for Monica and Brian, the investment was worth it. After all, Elizabeth's house was in a valued area, worth a good amount on the market, not to mention the savings she'd kept over decades of hard work. In their heads, this was practically an early inheritance, and they saw no problem in speeding up the process. When they left the office, Monica called Brian as soon as they got into their respective cars. "We're doing the right thing, aren't we?" she asked, but it wasn't a real question. It was just looking for validation, for someone to say yes, that all of this was justifiable. Brian answered without hesitation. "Of course we are. She needs professional help, and we need to make sure she doesn't spend everything on nonsense. It's our responsibility." The ease with which they lied to themselves was almost impressive. In the following weeks, they started collecting evidence. Monica convinced a doctor acquaintance to sign a vague document about concerns regarding the cognitive capacity of the elderly. Brian took photos of Elizabeth's house at angles that made it look sloppy, messy, when in reality, she kept everything clean and organized. They even recorded audios of conversations where Elizabeth supposedly confused dates or repeated the same stories, conveniently editing out any context that showed she was perfectly lucid. What Monica and Brian didn't expect, not for a second, was that their entire carefully architected plan could crumble because of exactly the dog they despised so much. Buddy, that animal that in their eyes was just another weight, an expense, an obstacle. He'd be the key to unmasking all the greed and family betrayal hiding behind that facade of concern. But that, well, they'd only find out when it was too late to turn back. 3 months after that meeting at the law office, Elizabeth received a court summons that made her world collapse once and for all. It was a summons for a guardianship hearing. Monica and Brian were officially asking for her to be declared incapable of taking care of herself. Her hands trembled so much while reading that paper that she had to sit on the kitchen floor, with Buddy immediately coming to lie beside her. "They really went all the way," she whispered, incredulous, feeling a mix of dread and indignation rising in her chest. She looked for a lawyer, Mr. Thomas Grant, an older man who accepted the case almost out of compassion when he heard her story. "Elizabeth, you need to be prepared. They're going to try to paint a picture of fragility, of incapacity, but the truth is on your side, and we're going to prove it." In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Thomas prepared her, asked difficult questions, requested medical documents that proved her lucidity, and it was his idea to bring Buddy. "Sometimes," he said with a smile, "the best defense doesn't come from papers, but from concrete actions." The day of the hearing arrived like an inevitable storm. Elizabeth entered the courthouse with Buddy on a leash, feeling everyone's eyes on her. Monica and Brian were already there, sitting next to lawyer Richard Sullivan, and when they saw the dog, they exchanged looks of disapproval. "Of course she brought the animal," Monica muttered, rolling her eyes. But Elizabeth kept her head high, her hands firm on the leash, even with her heart beating like a runaway drum inside her chest. The judge, a serious man with graying hair named Harold Morrison, opened the session and began hearing the arguments. Richard Sullivan went first, speaking with that sharp rhetoric about clear signs of cognitive decline, irrational decisions, and inability to manage her own life. He presented the photos of the house, the edited audios, even that vague medical report. Elizabeth felt her stomach turn with each lie told with such conviction, as if they were absolute truths that couldn't be contested. It was when Thomas Grant's turn came that things started to change. He asked permission to do a demonstration, and the judge, curious, nodded positively. Thomas looked at Elizabeth and gestured. She stood up, released Buddy's leash, and with a firm voice began giving simple commands. "Sit, lie down, stay, come." Buddy obeyed each one precisely, those brown eyes fixed on her with total attention and loyalty. The room fell silent, watching that genuine connection between woman and animal. Thomas took advantage of the moment, addressing the judge calmly. "Your Honor, Mrs. Elizabeth doesn't just take care of this animal, she trained him, keeps him healthy, fulfills all the obligations that requires. She manages her finances, pays her bills on time, keeps her house organized. The medical documents we brought prove she's in full mental capacity." He made a strategic pause, letting those words weigh in the air. If she were incapable, as her children claim, how would she be able to do all this? Judge Morrison leaned forward, looking directly at Monica and Brian with an expression that mixed curiosity and distrust. "You claim your mother is incapable of taking care of herself, but she clearly maintains a large, well-trained and healthy animal. That requires responsibility, consistency, planning ability." He flipped through the documents in front of him, examining the evidence presented. "These photos show a lived-in house, not a neglected one. These audios seem inconclusive, and this medical report is extremely vague." Buddy, as if sensing this was an important moment, walked over to Elizabeth and laid his head on her lap as she sat down again. She petted his golden fur, feeling tears of relief starting to form in her eyes. The judge observed that scene, the pure connection, the mutual affection, the calm the dog brought to Elizabeth. It was impossible to look at that and conclude she was an incapable, confused, or negligent person. It was exactly the opposite. Richard Sullivan tried to counter-argue, talk about future risks and necessary prevention. But the judge interrupted him with a hand gesture. "Mr. Sullivan, what I see here isn't an incapable woman. What I see is a perfectly lucid woman being attacked by children who, I dare say, seem to have interests that go beyond genuine concern." The words fell like bombs in the room, and Monica and Brian went pale. The secret revealed, the true intention behind everything, was laid bare right there in front of everyone, and there was no way to hide it anymore. Judge Morrison wasn't a man to leave things half done, and the tension in the room only increased with each second. He looked directly at Monica and Brian, that penetrating gaze of someone who's seen all kinds of people pass through the courthouse and knows how to recognize falsehood when he sees it. "I'd like to hear from you," he said, his voice calm but loaded with authority. What exactly are your concerns regarding your mother? And please, be specific. Monica swallowed hard, exchanging a nervous look with Brian. This wasn't in the script they'd rehearsed. Brian was the first to try to answer, stuttering a bit at the beginning. Well, Your Honor, it's just that she's alone in that big house, and we worry about her safety, you know? And there are the expenses with the dog, which are high, and— The judge interrupted him, raising his hand. Are her expenses your problem? Does she have debts? Overdue bills? Brian opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. No, sir, but we think she could be using the money in a more prudent way. Monica tried to save the situation, that calculated coldness returning. What my brother means is that our mother is aging, and we want to make sure she has adequate care. A place with structure, qualified professionals. The judge cut her off again, this time with a touch of impatience. A nursing home, you mean? And her house, I presume, would be sold to fund this? Monica hesitated. It was a trap and she knew it, but there was no way out. Yes, it would be the most logical. It was at that moment that Thomas Grant asked to speak and presented something that made the room's atmosphere completely change. Your Honor, I'd like to call some witnesses. 3 of Elizabeth's neighbors entered the room, Mrs. Martha, Mr. Robert, and young Claire, who lived on the corner. One by one, they confirmed that Elizabeth was perfectly capable, lucid, active. Martha told how Elizabeth helped her when she broke her arm last year, doing shopping for her. Robert mentioned the conversations at the fence, always coherent and cheerful. Claire talked about how Buddy was well cared for, always clean, healthy, obedient. With each testimony, Monica and Brian's faces got redder, more tense. They didn't expect this. They were sure no one would get involved, that they'd be able to conduct that hearing without interference. But the truth was being laid bare there, word by word, and there was no way to escape it. The judge took notes, nodding occasionally, and his expression made it clear he'd already reached a conclusion about this whole situation. When the testimonies ended, the judge addressed Monica and Brian again, but this time the tone was different, harder, almost accusatory. Let me see if I understand. Your mother maintains healthy relationships with the neighborhood, takes care of an animal in an exemplary way, pays her bills on time, keeps her house in order. And you want me to declare she's incapable? He made a deliberate pause, letting the silence weigh. Or is what you really want access to her assets? The house, the savings. The total humiliation was palpable. You could feel it in the air, see it in everyone's expressions in the room. Monica tried to protest, but her voice came out weak, without conviction. It's not like that, Your Honor. We just want what's best for her. But the judge wasn't listening anymore. He turned to Richard Sullivan, the lawyer for the two, with an expression of disapproval. Mr. Sullivan, I hope you advised your clients well about the implications of filing a frivolous lawsuit like this, because that's exactly what this is. Frivolous, and I dare say, cruel. It became clear to everyone there that Monica and Brian's objective was never to protect Elizabeth. It was to take what was hers, assume control, get rid of the burden she represented in their busy lives. The family betrayal was completely exposed, without masks, without excuses to sustain the farce. The public scandal of that moment, with neighbors testifying against their own children, with a judge unmasking the blatant greed. It was the kind of shame that doesn't fade, that sticks to your skin and stays there, burning. Elizabeth, sitting with Buddy at her feet, felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because the truth had won, because she wasn't going to lose her house or her dog. But sadness because seeing her children being unmasked like that, seeing their greed laid bare for everyone to see, it was a pain that would never completely heal. She looked at Monica and Brian, searching for some sign of regret, of genuine shame, but all she saw was poorly disguised anger and wounded pride. They'd lost, and worse than that, everyone knew exactly who they really were. Judge Morrison banged the gavel on the table with a dry sound that echoed through the entire room, sealing the fate of that hearing once and for all. The guardianship request is denied. Mrs. Elizabeth Carter is in full mental and legal capacity to manage her own life and assets. He paused, looking severely at Monica and Brian. Furthermore, it's legally determined that no one, and I emphasize, no one, can separate Mrs. Carter from her pet without her express consent. Everything is registered and filed. It was complete victory, documented, irrevocable. Elizabeth felt her legs weaken with relief, and if she hadn't been sitting, she probably would have fallen right there. Tears started rolling down her face, but this time they weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were of liberation, you know? She hugged Buddy tight, burying her face in his soft fur, whispering, "We did it," like a mantra. The dog licked her tears, his tail wagging gently, as if understanding this was a moment of shared victory between the two. Monica and Brian stood up abruptly from their chairs, both their faces red with anger and humiliation. They didn't even look at Elizabeth, not for a second, not a glance. They simply grabbed their things and headed toward the door, Richard Sullivan following them with that expression of someone who lost a case they thought was guaranteed. Brian still muttered something to Monica in the hallway, but Elizabeth couldn't hear, and honestly, she didn't want to know what they had to say anymore. It was Mrs. Martha who broke the heavy silence that remained in the room after they left. She approached Elizabeth, put her hand on her shoulder, and said with that heavy accent, "You were very brave, dear, very brave." The other neighbors also came to congratulate her, offer support, say they always knew she was fine. That human warmth, that unexpected solidarity, warmed Elizabeth's chest in a way she hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. Thomas Grant, the lawyer who had accepted to defend her, approached with a genuine smile. "Elizabeth, you didn't just win today. You sent an important message that no one can take your dignity without a fight. I'm proud to have been your lawyer." He shook her hand firmly, and Elizabeth thanked him with her voice still choked. She knew that victory wouldn't have been possible without his help, without the neighbors, and especially without Buddy. The dog everyone said was a burden, but who had been her salvation? When she finally left the courthouse, with Buddy by her side and the sun hitting her face, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. Real freedom. Without fear. Without that threatening shadow hanging over her head. She could go back home, to her life, without having to look over her shoulder, expecting someone to come rip her away from there. The house was hers. Buddy was hers. Her life was hers. And no one could question that anymore. On the way back, inside the car Thomas kindly offered, Elizabeth looked out the window and reflected on everything that had happened. Had she lost her children? Yes, in a way she had, because even if she wanted to, she couldn't look at Monica and Brian the same way anymore. Family betrayal leaves scars that don't disappear with time, but at the same time, she'd gained something precious, the certainty of who was really by her side, of who really cared about her without hidden agendas. Buddy was sitting in the back seat, his head resting on Elizabeth's arm, those brown eyes full of a loyalty that didn't need words to be expressed. "You didn't just stay with me," she whispered, petting his ear. "You saved me. For real." And that was it. Buddy had been the silent witness who unmasked all the falsehood, the key that opened the door to truth, the living proof that Elizabeth was perfectly capable and loved just by the right people. When they arrived home and Elizabeth opened the door, feeling that familiar smell that only our home has, she allowed herself to cry freely. But this time, they were tears of gratitude. Gratitude for having fought, for having found good people along the way, for having a four-legged companion who never gave up on her. Monica and Brian's planned revenge had crumbled, and who came out victorious was her, not out of malice, but out of pure and simple justice. The months that followed that hearing transformed Elizabeth's life in a way she could never have imagined. The house, which before seemed too big and too quiet, started gaining life again. But this time, in a different way, lighter, more real. Elizabeth decided that if Buddy had saved her life, she could use this second chance to save others too. That's how she started taking in rescued animals, one at a time, giving them the same love and care she gave her faithful companion. First came Max, an elderly Labrador nobody wanted to adopt because he had problems with his hind legs. Then Luna showed up, a shy mixed breed who'd been abandoned pregnant and needed a safe place to have her puppies. Elizabeth transformed the guest room into a kind of temporary refuge with soft beds, bowls of fresh water, and all the affection those animals had never received. Buddy took on the role of pack leader, teaching the younger ones, protecting the more fragile ones, being exactly what Elizabeth always knew he was, a silent hero. The entire community started noticing the change. Neighbors who before only waved from afar now stopped to talk, offered help, brought donations of dog food and blankets. Mrs. Martha practically became an unofficial partner, showing up every week with treats and stories to tell. Mr. Robert built a better fence in the yard, for free, just because it was the right thing to do. Claire, the young woman from the corner, started bringing her nephews to play with the dogs, teaching the children about compassion and responsibility from an early age. Elizabeth became known in town as the Dog Lady, and she loved that title. Wore it with pride, you know? Sometimes local reporters would show up wanting to do stories about her, about how a 75-year-old woman had become an example of courage and love. She always accepted, but made sure to give credit to Buddy. It wasn't me who saved anyone. He saved me first, and now we're just passing it forward. Her emotional story touched hearts wherever it went, inspiring other people to help too. Monica and Brian? Well, they simply disappeared from Elizabeth's life. No calls, no visits, no apologies. Nothing. And you know what? Elizabeth made peace with that. She had cried, had felt the pain of loss, but eventually realized that some people simply don't deserve space in our lives, even if they're blood family. Real family, she learned, is the one that stays by your side in difficult times, that protects you, that loves you without wanting anything in return. There were days when Elizabeth sat on the porch, with Buddy beside her and the other dogs scattered around the yard, and simply gave thanks. Gave thanks for having found strength to fight, for having good people around, for having discovered a new purpose at this stage of life. The house Monica and Brian wanted so badly to sell had become a sanctuary of second chances, both for the animals and for herself. And there was no money in the world that could buy that feeling of fulfillment. One day, almost a year after the hearing, Elizabeth received an anonymous letter. Inside was a simple note. "Thank you for inspiring me not to give up. Your story gave me courage to face my own family. You're an example to all of us." Elizabeth read that, with tears in her eyes, realizing that what happened to her wasn't in vain. It had a greater meaning, had touched lives she didn't even know, and that, in some strange and beautiful way, healed some of the pain her children's betrayal had left. Buddy aged beside her, slower and more tired, but still with that look full of love and loyalty. Elizabeth knew that one day she'd have to say goodbye to him, and just thinking about it made her heart ache. But she also knew that when that moment came, she'd be able to move forward, because Buddy had taught her that true love never dies. It just transforms and keeps living in every gesture of kindness, in every life we touch, in every second chance we give someone. Everyone who knew Elizabeth knew her story, how her ungrateful children tried to take everything, how she almost lost her best friend, how justice prevailed in the end. But more than that, they knew it was Buddy who gave back her dignity and freedom, who proved to the entire world that she was capable, strong, and deserving of respect. The burning house of betrayal had been extinguished, and in its place something new was born, beautiful and full of hope. A home where love was unconditional and loyalty was worth more than any fortune. In the end, Elizabeth didn't just recover her freedom. She discovered that real family isn't the one that shares the same blood, but the one that stays by your side when everything falls apart. Buddy wasn't just a dog. He was the silent hero who gave back her dignity when everyone thought she no longer had the strength to fight. And you? Have you ever gone through a situation where someone from your own family betrayed you or tried to take something precious from you? What would you do if you were in Elizabeth's place? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes, just talking about it, we start to heal these wounds. If this emotional story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring life lessons and make us reflect on our own choices and relationships. Until the next story.